So welcome to this latest session in our Jewish medical ethics series run by Jewish Renaissance and the Lions Learning Project. For those who don't know me, my name is Aviva Dorch. I'm the director of Jewish Renaissance, and I'm going to be chairing the session because, as I began to hint at last week, I've got a personal connection to this area. So just to put this session tonight in context, last week we were looking at genetic screening. We were looking at what happens pre-conception. Tonight we're very much looking at conception and reproduction. So we are moving on chronologically. But at the end of last week's session, I talked about the history of Sachs research in the United Kingdom and how my mum, Dr. Sybil Simon, was the person who founded the Tay-Sachs and Allied Diseases Association in the 1980s. What I'd like to do tonight is actually go back 10 years before to 1978. But I'm staying with my mum's career because in 1978, my mum was working at Oldham General Hospital, which those people who know about reproductive technology might know about as the birthplace of a baby called Louise Brown, who was the first IVF baby. So my mum was on that team. She worked under a doctor called Patrick Steptoe, who ran that team. She was a paediatrician and geneticist, but she had to leave because she got pregnant with me. So I'm exactly 3 months older than the first IVF child, which for me is remarkable because when I was preparing for tonight, I had a conversation with Guila, who I'm going to introduce you to a bit later. And she said since the beginning of IVF, there have been over 8 million children born using IVF. So literally in the span of my lifetime, IVF has gone from not being possible at all to helping over 8 million families to assist them with their reproduction process. And nowadays, I mean, 43 and a bit years on, there is so much more that is possible. So we are going to begin with IVF tonight, but we're going to end with technologies such as uterine transplants, mitochondrial DNA and 3-person eggs, you know, the whole range, different things that are possible now with surrogacy, the whole range of new reproductive technology, and how much things have advanced over the years. We have 2 really incredible speakers with us who I'm delighted to be able to call friends. We're starting with Professor Susan Martha Kahn from Harvard. Susan Kahn's a social anthropologist, formerly the director of the Centre for Middle Eastern Studies. She's now the associate director of the Julius Rabinowitz program on Jewish and Israeli law at Harvard Law School. We've invited her tonight because she's the author of this book, which I'm hoping my camera is going to be able to focus in on and see, which is called Reproducing Jews. When it was published in 2000, it won the National Jewish Book Award, the Musher Prize from the National Foundation for Jewish Culture, and the Eileen Basker Memorial Award for the Society for Medical Anthropology. So Sue's going to talk, I think, a little bit about the research she did for this book, but also maybe about some of the children or what it might mean that some of the children she was thinking about have now come of age. The book was, well, she will tell us more, but I think the book was particularly sparked because Susan realised that there were more at this point when she was doing her research in the late 90s and the book was published in 2000, that there were more fertility clinics per capita in Israel than in any other country in the world. Just to think about that, and that Israel had the world's highest per capita rate of in vitro fertilization procedures. So Sue's research focused primarily on Israel. Sue's going to talk for us for about half an hour. And then we're going to bring it to the present and also to Britain. So the second speaker we have with us, Guila Vas Mouyal, is the Outreach Research and Development Manager of Jnetics. Guila's got two master's degrees. One is a Master of Science in Reproductive Science and Women's Health, and the other is a Master's of Research in Reproductive Sociology. And as part of this second degree, the second project, she conducted field research both in Israel, but also in the UK. So she was working with IVF professionals and social workers in fertility clinics. She did interviews with rabbis in London regarding Jewish law on assisted reproductive technology. But she also interviewed many Orthodox Jewish women who were going through or thinking about the process and asked for their thoughts on the use of ART, of assisted reproductive technology. So we'll start with Sue in Israel and in the 1990s and 2000s, and then we'll come to Guila for 2022 and Britain. So thank you to both of these amazing speakers, and I'm going to pass over to Susan Kahn to start us off.
Thank you so much, Aviva, and I'm just absolutely delighted to be here with you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I said to the organizers, I'm speaking to you from the original Cambridge here just outside of Boston, and I'm just very, very grateful to be invited to join you. So I'm going to give you just a very quick overview of the research that I did and some of the issues that were raised. And then, of course, I'm very happy to answer any questions that you might have. You know, this story really goes back to the 1950s, which is when artificial insemination first became practiced amongst human beings, right? It had been used amongst animals for to assist a conception with animals, but it really wasn't until the late 40s, 1950s that sperm donation began to be used by doctors to solve certain kinds of male infertility. And that's important because that's when you start seeing rabbis discuss, Orthodox rabbis begin to discuss what are the possible uses of this kind of technology to conceive Jews. How could Jews possibly use artificial insemination in order to conceive Jews? You know, this, you need to fast forward then until to the 1970s, as Aviva mentioned, when suddenly these all of these technologies began to proliferate, and eggs could be removed from women's bodies and fertilized outside of the body with sperm, and then the embryo could be reimplanted, and it just suddenly there was an entire revolution, as I'm sure you're all very familiar with, in how you could conceive human beings and how people were conceiving human beings. So on one level, this was a wonderful innovation, a wonderful set of medical innovations that helped ease the suffering of infertility for human beings, and in our case, for Jews. And that's it's very straightforward, right? The technologies exist to ease suffering. So let's see what we can do to implement them in ways that are halakhically consistent with ideas about Jewish kinship. That was the question that began to percolate in the minds of particularly Orthodox rabbis. How can we use these technologies to conceive completely kosher Jews? And now that sperm can be separated from the male body and eggs can be separated from the female body, and these genetic entities can be combined and then reinserted into a third body in the form of an embryo. How do we do this in ways that are consistent with traditional ideas about Jewish kinship? So we started with a range of technologies that solved a very practical and very serious form of suffering in the Jewish community. And then a number of halakhic challenges were raised about how best to combine sperm, eggs, and wombs in ways that were consistent with traditional halakhic ideas about where Jewishness comes from. And then you began to see, particularly in Israel, which is where I was doing my field work, you began to see an absolute rush to use these technologies, both amongst infertile people, certainly amongst rabbis who began to really became overwhelmed with the challenge of issuing decisions in a very pretty rapid way as the technologies developed, so that by the 1990s, you had kind of an extraordinary moment of rapidly developing new technologies, rabbis who were racing to figure out how to provide guidance about how to use these technologies in ways that were commensurate with Jewish law, and a overall political and social context where the value of reproduction was completely all-consuming, right? Where the social pressure to have children, certainly in the Israeli context, in the Jewish-Israeli context, was absolutely overwhelming. And it was into that mix that I started my fieldwork as an anthropologist and began to interview people in a number of different realms, both Orthodox rabbis to try and figure out how they were thinking about these technologies, infertile people themselves who were in fertility clinics, going to fertility clinics all over Israel. I also was very interested in talking to public health officials to try and figure out how they were creating the avenues to use these technologies in ways that were ethical, which was a big challenge. And I was trying to tell a story about a particular moment when Jewish kinship was becoming literal, right? Where the question of where Jews come from was suddenly becoming a very literal question. Do Jews come from eggs? Do they come from sperm? Or do they come from wombs? Or in what combination can we combine these entities, these genetic entities, in order to reproduce Jews? So I'll cut to the chase. And the chase is that after extensive halakhic deliberations and trying to figure out how to legislate for the use of new reproductive technologies in a way that makes literal traditional Jewish kinship beliefs, there was a consensus that, and it was a very practical consensus. In addition to be a halakhic consensus, it was a practical consensus. The upshot was in the 1990s and early 2000s that Jews come from Jewish wombs. Now that's interesting in and of itself. Jews don't come from Jewish sperm. They don't necessarily come from Jewish eggs, but they do come from the process of being gestated in a Jewish womb. And those of you, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to try and figure out why they came to that conclusion. And one of the reasons they came to that conclusion is that they were working with Talmudic precedents where the question was, how do you determine the maternity, who the mother of a child is? And in the traditional rabbinic imagination, a mother is determined by who is the woman who gives birth, right? It certainly sounds very logical that a woman is the mother of a child to whom she gives birth. So that metaphor for thinking about where motherhood comes from, and therefore, as we all know, Jewishness is matrilineal, was a very important question, that if a mother is determined by the act of giving birth, then it's the act of giving birth that confers maternality and that confers Jewishness. So that it's very, in some sense, very intuitive and very straightforward, but it created a lot of unintended consequences, and that ruling or that way of thinking about where Jewishness comes from that was made literal by the advent of these technologies created a lot of challenges, or as I say, unintended consequences. And one of them was, one way to think about these are by imagining different scenarios. So for example, let's say you have an Orthodox Jewish couple, the man is suffering from a severe form of male infertility, and the woman needs to, the only way for her to conceive a child and alleviate the suffering of infertility is to use sperm that comes from a donor. And the rabbi said, this is halachically permitted because the child conceived in this way will be Jewish regardless of the origin of the sperm. But if we begin to think about, well, where should the sperm come from if it doesn't come from her husband? Well, and again, I'll cut to the chase here. The universal consensus among Orthodox Jewish rabbis is that ideally the sperm should come from a non-Jew. And there were two reasons for that, at least two reasons. One of them was, how do you procure sperm for artificial insemination? Well, you have to compel a man to masturbate, and that's against Jewish law. So that's one very practical reason that the consensus preferred the sperm of a non-Jewish man. Another interesting wrinkle to this story is that the origin, the non-Jewishness of the non-Jewish man's sperm is not conferred and does not confer any form of relatedness between the non-Jewish donor and the subsequent child, and it also doesn't confirm any form of non-Jewishness to the child so conceived. Because as we know, Jewishness is conferred, or is the conduit for Jewishness is through the matriline. So there was really non-Jewish sperm, it turned out, was quite a remarkable substance because it could create Jewishness create a Jewish child without either compelling the man, either compelling a Jewish man to commit, to masturbate and deal with that prohibition, to contradict that prohibition. And it also allowed a Jewish man, a non-Jewish man, to create a Jewish child. The other more important in some ways, or the next wrinkle to why non-Jewish sperm was preferred, was because Jewish, what is the definition of adultery according to Jewish law? It's when a Jewish woman conceives a child with a Jewish man who's not her husband. So if she conceived a child using sperm from a Jewish donor, that child could be considered a mamzer, would be considered a mamzer, in fact. That child would be the product of an adulterous relationship, because a married Jewish, sort of in vitro adultery, because a married Jewish woman would have conceived a child using Jewish sperm that did not come from her husband. So I've given you three reasons, the three rabbinic reasons why non-Jewish sperm was preferred as the solution to male factor infertility for Orthodox Jewish couples. So that was in some ways an unintended consequence of that halakhic ruling. So you then had a practice where non-Jewish frozen sperm from college students in Wisconsin was being flown to ultra-Orthodox fertility clinics in Mea Shearim in Jerusalem to conceive ultra-Orthodox Jewish babies. So that was it was a very practical solution, but it was in some ways quite an unintended configuration for conceiving completely kosher Jews. The other unintended consequence, and I'm hoping actually that the second speaker will talk a little bit more, the technologies that having to do with ovum donation and egg freezing, et cetera, have advanced so tremendously in the last 20 years that some of the concerns that the rabbis had about eggs and egg donation have in fact been made obsolete. I'm happy to talk about that though, because you did have a great deal of popular desire amongst Orthodox Jews who were looking to conceive, looking for egg donations in couples where the form of infertility was a kind of female factor infertility, where there was a problem with the woman's eggs, regardless of what the rabbi said, that the so-called Jewishness of the egg is irrelevant to the conception of a subsequent Jewish child, as long as that embryo is gestated in the Jewish womb, you did have a widespread preference amongst infertile couples for Jewish donor eggs. And that created a whole range of quite serious economic problems, ethical problems, and other forms of practical challenges in how do you compel Jewish women to donate their eggs to other Jewish women, that was resolved in the Israeli case in really, really problematic ways, and in ways that they have since, that the ethical commissions in Israel have since been really trying to remedy, because it created an enormously vulnerable population of, it made unmarried Jewish women into a vulnerable population who were being targeted for the sort of mining of their Jewish eggs. And there was a great deal of ambivalence about that, and a widespread recognition in the medical and rabbinic community and the public policy community that this was really a sort of an untenable situation. And I'm happy to talk to you about some of the ways that some of the situations that created, and some of the problems that grew out from that decision. But one of the other unintended consequences was that you had a widespread, in the 90s, and it's continued, a widespread baby boom amongst unmarried Israeli women. And those women are either, unmarried heterosexual women who either haven't found a partner or don't want to have a child with a partner, or they're unmarried Israeli lesbians, amongst whom there's been an enormous, just a huge baby boom in Israel. And one's sexual orientation or one's marital status is no longer seen as any kind of impediment to reproducing, now that artificial insemination particularly is so widespread and so available. And there's been a kind of, certainly amongst secular Jews, but even amongst modern Orthodox Jews, there's been a widespread growing acceptance of children conceived by unmarried women with donor sperm. And again, that donor sperm can come from either a Jewish donor or a non-Jewish donor. There aren't the same kind of problems with conceiving a mamzer if you're an unmarried Jewish woman looking for to conceive a child using donor sperm. And sometimes amongst unmarried Jewish women, there's a preference, in fact, for Jewish sperm, just for a more popular imagination of wanting to maintain a kind of Jewish continuity. But again, I want to make a really clear difference between what the halachic opinions are, what the rabbinic opinions are, and what Jewish law permits or prohibits, and what the opinions are or the desires are amongst infertile Jews themselves, who may be operating with a very different set of desires, needs, etc. So, the thing that's so interesting to me is that these technologies emerged in the 50s, began to proliferate in the 1980s. By the 1990s, there was this, surge of kind of a rush, a stampede, both amongst the rabbis, amongst infertile people, and amongst medical professionals, to try and figure out how can we bring all of these things together in order to reproduce as many Jews as possible, right? And now, in the ensuing 20 years, in the last 20 years or so much, certainly the technologies have continued to develop and become more normalized. But now you have the children who are conceived in these ways coming of reproductive age themselves. And that raises, and there are anthropologists in Israel particularly who are continuing to do research on these topics, but it raises a whole range of additional questions regarding the stigma of having been conceived using artificial donor sperm or donor eggs, or being gestated in a surrogate, fantasies or concerns about the conference, particularly in Orthodox community, concerns about infertility of the mother being conferred through the child who was conceived using artificial technology, artificial reproductive technology, and whether those problems will be transmuted to the child so conceived. Certainly a whole range of questions about making sure that people who have been born of these technologies do not unwittingly enter into incestuous or adulterous relationships with people to whom they are unknowingly genetically related. All of those, and the rabbis in Israel have developed a whole range of kind of checks and balances to try and ensure that that doesn't happen. And a whole, I think a whole range of other questions about what constitutes the family and what is the framework in which we bring up and raise the next generation of Jewish individuals. And in fact, do these technologies perhaps make some of our traditional beliefs about where Jews have always come from, in fact, has prompted us to think more imaginatively about all of the solutions that that Jewish men and women faced with infertility traditionally improvised when facing problems of infertility. So now we have technological solutions to infertility, but certainly, women and men who have wanted to have children in a traditional Jewish context have been quite have historically been very imaginative in coming up with ways to obviate their infertility. And I mentioned that just because I think that technology and single mothers and conceiving Jewish children using non-Jewish sperm and the sort of legitimation of those children obviously has a historical context and a historical background. And I think these technologies, while obviously they're completely unprecedented and totally new, in some ways they reveal ways that Jewish families have always been kind of factories of creativity, for which I think it's just something to think about. It's an interesting question about has that sort of flexibility and creativity and certainly the urge to reproduce no matter what the obstacles are, has that been a contributing factor in Jewish survival in all of its, different, in all of our different contexts, et cetera. So I just like to, I'll end with that, to think these are unprecedented technologies, but on another hand, they in some ways are a continuation of the kind of innovation that I think Jewish individuals and communities have always exercised when faced with questions about how to persist and continue.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So we've already got questions coming in. And I'm actually going to just ask you one of those now, or make one of those points, because someone said a really interesting thing about talking about using non-Jewish sperm, especially in terms of what we were talking about last week with genetic screening, is that was any thought of that also the reduction of inherited Jewish diseases, and has that influx of non-Jewish sperm shifted kind of the demographics of diseases amongst Jews genetically?
That's such a great question. I imagine Guila can answer it more specifically, but I was it was one of my original questions too, and I was quite surprised and quite interested. I did a whole stream of field work with single Israeli women who were choosing donor sperm, and they could choose between Jewish and non-Jewish donor sperm because they weren't faced with the same kind of halakhic fears about conceiving mamzers. And they overwhelmingly chose Jewish donors, despite the well-known and well-founded genetic concerns. That's not to say that some of those individuals that I interviewed didn't deliberately and consciously make a choice as single women to use non-Jewish sperm because of their concerns about Tay-Sachs, et cetera. And I think, now the panel of so-called Jewish genetic mutations is up to, I think, about 14 or 15 clearly identifiable Jewish, risk factors for, particularly amongst Ashkenazi Jews, but amongst Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews as well. There's a whole list of, potentially dangerous combinations, so-called dangerous combinations. But despite that, there was, that may have changed, but when I was doing the work, I was surprised to discover how individual women making that decision were very happy to take the risk. And part of that was they wanted to conceive a child that looked like them. Right. So I think there were a whole range of factors that went into that preference, a whole range of biases, a whole range of prejudices, a whole range of factors that went into it. But I think they wanted to conceive a child with whom they felt a degree of relatedness.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, as I say, the questions are already flooding in for you. I've got at least 3 more, but I think we'll hold off for now if that's okay with everybody. We'll invite Guila into the conversation, and then we'll bring both Guila and Susan up together after Gila's spoken and take some of those questions all together in a Q&A. So let me just say to everyone, first of all, thank you, Susan, but say to everyone, please put your questions in the chat to me, and we will absolutely take those in about 15 minutes or so after Gila's spoken. All right, thank you, and over to Guila.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me tonight. I'll just wait for some of the slides that I prepared to be put up on screen, and then we'll get started. Thank you so much. So firstly, thank you so much, Aviva, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share my research with everyone tonight. And secondly, thank you so much to Professor Kahn. She's done an amazing amount of work in this field, and your conversation tonight has been so interesting and just so amazing to learn about the beginnings of some of the technologies. If we can have the second slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, perfect. So as some of you can see on the screen, I thought that before starting and learning about the new technologies, it would be first interesting to look at how these technologies here on the screen were the first assisted reproductive technologies that we had over the last 40 years. And as Aviva said at the beginning of this call, over the last 40-something years, we've had more than 8 million babies born as a result of artificial insemination, in vitro fertilization, surrogacy, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, ICSI, sperm donation, and egg donation. These technologies have not only allowed the birth of these babies, but have dramatically changed the way people reproduce and how they go on to have the babies of their dreams. So now, if we can go into the next slide, please. Thank you. Where are we now in terms of assisted reproductive technologies? So over the last 10 to 20 years, we have had 2 additions onto what we call the ARTS family, and that is the assisted reproductive technologies. And we look at 2 specific ones because they have added more questions to some of the debates that we had already in terms of family, kinship, motherhood and fatherhood, and also have given opportunity for parents to have children and as well as single individuals. So to begin with, let's look at uterine transplantation. So the first successful uterine transplantation was done in the year 2000, and the first successful live birth was in 2014. And since then, this technology has allowed women that say perhaps were born without a uterus, or women that could not successfully hold a pregnancy to term to be able to have children. And this has been a huge, huge addition to the technologies, as it can sometimes offer an alternative to surrogacy. Now, when we move on to mitochondrial donation, what is that And what does that mean? So mitochondrial donation is very unique. So we find mitochondrial in the cells, and they are very important because they have a very specific function in which they allow energy to be formed. We know scientifically that women have very specific DNA in their mitochondrial, and this is different than what is found in men. So sometimes it can occur that there is a malformation or a variation in this DNA, and it can lead to miscarriages, for pregnancies to terminate, or for people not to be able to have children. So there is a possibility to have mitochondrial donation in which a healthy woman without a mitochondrial variation in their DNA donates her DNA to another woman's egg. And then this egg can be fertilized and then create a baby. So what's interesting about this new technology is that it allows the creation of an embryo, but it is an embryo that now has 3 types of DNA. So as you can already begin to imagine, we would have 2 copies of each gene, one from your mother, one from the father. This type of donation increases the DNA to 3 types. So as you can start thinking, what are some of the ethical and moral questions? If I can have the next slide, please. So before we move on to the ethical questions and the moral dilemmas, I've always been struck by this quote of George Orwell's novel, a novel that was published in 1949. And if you'll allow me, I'll just like to read it to really emphasize. Children will be taken from their mothers at birth, as one takes eggs from a hen. The sex instinct will be eradicated. Procreation will be annual formality, like the renewal of a ration card. We shall abolish the orgasm. Our neurologists are at work upon it now. There will be no loyalty except loyalty towards the party. There'll be no love except the love of the big brother. Now, this always struck me because as a scientist and as a researcher of reproductive sociology, I always wondered how these technologies might be giving the parents, the couples, the individuals, the children that they want, but what is this doing for their relationships, to the way they conceive, to their family, to their unity? How is this impacting people? Next slide, please. So on this slide, you can see that these are some of the ethical and moral dilemmas that exist and some of the questions that Professor Kahn has presented. So for instance, these technologies, and over the last 43 years, we have had the creation of what we call modern families. So families where, for instance, children can have, as we said, 3 parents, a surrogate mother. They were perhaps born as a result of donated gametes, being egg or sperm. There could be also families where children might never know who their biological parents are, as they have been born as a result of anonymous donation. As Professor Kahn mentioned, there's a new a form of parenthood, which is solo parenthood. So whether that's single mothers wanting to fulfill their dreams of having a child, or that's men. Another very popular technology and interesting technique that we have applied is social egg freezing. And what is that? So let's say, for example, a young woman or wants to have a career, wants to travel, doesn't want to think about having children. She can put away her eggs for storage and then come back to these when she then decides to have a family. So what does that mean for what we know is the nuclear family? Now, another very interesting question that appears when we look at the ethics and is, at what age should somebody stop trying to conceive, and where should be the limit to allow people to have children? So for instance, we have seen some cases, and I'm sure you've seen on the news and in magazines, some mothers that give birth at 60, or strange cases where a woman carries as a surrogate for her daughter, and things like that. So where is the limit? At what age should we stop allowing people to conceive? Obviously taking the offspring quality of life into consideration. Now, a very important topic to me is genetic engineering and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So these technologies have dramatically changed the way that IVF is being done. So they have introduced what is now the selection of specific embryos to either control the genes. So for instance, let's say if a couple is a carrier of, let's say, Tay-Sachs, and they don't want to have children with that condition, they can select an embryo that is healthy and does not carry this genetic disease. Similarly, the opposing side of this amazing technology is that we can now choose for a sex of an embryo. So that means choosing the sex of a baby. So in some countries, this is legal. And obviously that's up to debate whether it's ethical or not. Should somebody choose the sex of their baby or not? And I'm happy to discuss this after. Now, when we look at these questions and we think about who is regulating assisting reproductive technologies and who's answering some of these. So in specific, in this country, in the United Kingdom, the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority regulates assisted reproductive technologies. And they regulate all the treatments in every clinic, and they make sure the clinics are accredited. And obviously they do this also in conjunction with the NHS. Now, at the moment, the NHS does offer some sort of support for couples needing assisted reproductive technology, but this is done on a lottery basis. So for instance, depending on where couples or individuals live, they'll receive different amounts of money and support to be able to have these different treatments. Obviously, different countries have different regulations. As we've heard from Professor Kahn, Israel is very different. And I think just to briefly mention, Israel is unbelievable in the way that they offer treatments to every single person, that is any woman and man, single, married, of any different varying level of observance. And they offer any treatment to at any age, even including all different treatments for free up until the birth of 2 children. So that is obviously a very important thing to note. And lastly, what are the religious authorities doing about some of these questions? And as we've heard from Professor Kahn, these are the questions that have been raised and have been discussed over the last 40 years. And next slide, please. Thank you. Now, so as Aviva mentioned at the beginning of this talk, part of my research was to interview Orthodox rabbis in London and as well as in Israel about these technologies. And a lot of the questions that were raised were, as Professor Kahn mentioned, relating to family kinship, what was allowed in terms of should gamete donation, should the donors be Jewish, should they not? What is allowed and what is not allowed. So from my research, what I understood was as you can see on this slide, the most fundamentalist Jewish point of view is that most treatments are allowed. And what's important to note is that usually cases are decided on a case-by-case principle, where individuals or couples will approach their rabbi and then they will go on to a Beth Din and then discuss the cases like this one by one. Based on what has been done in the past, what is the status of this couple, their psychological, financial, and then things are looked in this way. And as you can see on this slide, here are some of the questions that I picked up. So one question that always came up was about sperm donation and its use for IVF. And interestingly enough, I had rabbis that kept referring to the prohibition to waste seed. So rabbis thought, well, if this prohibition exists, then perhaps it's not a good idea for Jewish men to either donate or to have to use the IVF treatment. Obviously, this has been changed, and there is now a consensus that when used for IVF, sperm donation from one man to his family, to the couple, is allowed. Now, another question that was very interesting was, what if a couple, say, for example, is a Kohen family, and this family needs sperm donation? Will the Kohen status be inferred to their future son if the son is born not from his biological father being with a surname Kohen? So these were some of the questions. And another very interesting question that always popped up was the halachic mother and who infers Jewish status. So as Professor Kahn mentioned, this was always something. So is the birth mother the one that establishes Jewish status? Is it the egg donor, the DNA mother? Or as we've just learned, in the case of 3 DNA parents, who establishes Jewish status? So there was a general consensus on that answer, and it was usually, when they were in doubt, the way that the rabbis would decide would be to have any newborn baby born as a result of any of these donations dipped in the mikveh, just to make sure that any potential debates were clear and that baby was fully Jewish. And similarly, when we look at donation and its anonymity, the question of incest and yichud always popped up. So what should be done? How can we circumvent anonymity, and how can we make sure that there is no incest? And this is one of the gravest prohibitions in Jewish law. And very, very interestingly, the last question that I always had was, what about posthumous donation? And this was a case that always appeared in Israel. Unfortunately, as we know, because of the wars or just life in Israel, what happens if a couple was undergoing IVF or trying to have assisted reproductive technologies, and in between that time, the man died? So what can be done? Should a couple continue? Well, should the woman continue on her own and have a posthumous donation? So just to clarify, this would have been, say, sperm that was frozen from the husband, and then the husband went on to die. Should this woman be allowed to use this sperm to have a child? So these were some of the questions that appeared in my research. Next slide, please. So now moving on to Jewish women's experiences of infertility. So between the year 2016 and 2019, I embarked on a Master's of Research at University College London. And my interest in exploring these women's experiences was about learning, what did fertility mean to them? What did it mean to them in a community that is pronatalist, where family is everything, in a community that focuses on children, that emphasizes the importance to procreate, and more importantly, in a community where at times it is so visible that couples don't have children soon after they're married. So I interviewed 26 Orthodox Jewish women that lived in London. All these women experienced what is known as primary and secondary infertility. So primary refers to women that never had children, and secondary infertility refers to women that have had, let's say, one child, but then were not able to conceive afterwards. And this secondary infertility is quite important for these Orthodox Jewish women, as they themselves want to and are expected to have large families. So as you can imagine, in a community that is Orthodox and that expects them to have big families, these women are seen as strange and as outsiders to their own community. It's important to note here that these women never share their experiences with anyone, being their family at times, their friends, their rabbis, their community. It was very internal to them. They never shared. The women had a variety of treatments to circumvent their infertility. And lastly, I've put here that they had various levels of Orthodox observance. They were all Orthodox, but some of them were ultra-Orthodox, some were more modern Orthodox, and others just a mainstream Orthodox. Next slide, please. So as I started to discuss with the women about their experiences and just to learn from them what it meant to be infertile in the Jewish community, 4 themes started to appear and started to develop. And as you can see on the slide, these themes refer to destiny, my rabbi, my relationships, and my identity. And the only way that I can explain this is that in some ways, these women's lives were unraveled in these 4 particular ways. And we can begin to understand this because women saw their infertility as their destiny. This was something that they believed was chosen for them. It was something that was sent by God. It was something that God wanted them to go through, and more importantly, something that they felt that they couldn't change. So it was a path that was chosen for them. While this was what they believed, it was by no means easy for them to accept these tests of faith. And one interesting thing was, it was starting to become very clear that the only person that these women trusted was their rabbi. And that was very interesting. So for instance, the rabbi at times accompanied women to appointments. They had their rabbi on speed dial. They called at all times to ask all kinds of questions, whether being about medical treatments, understanding the different types of assisted reproductive technologies, learning about the Jewish laws, trying to understand what is okay, what is not okay. Should they have treatments on Shabbat? Should they have treatments on all the different Jewish holidays? So the rabbis became very close with the women. And then another important thing was I began to see that the women's relationships with their friends, community, and families were impacted. And it's a very sad thing for me to say, but I observed that the women's relationships with their mothers was what was most drastically impacted. There was so much pressure that the women felt from their mothers. And again, it's important to note that some of these women never told their mothers what they were going through. So they would hear comments from their mothers like, oh, I want to be a grandmother. Everybody expects me to have X, Y, and Z grandchildren. Why don't I have so many grandchildren? Why is this happening? So these relationships really deteriorated. And it was interesting to note because we would expect, or perhaps you'd think that the relationship with the partner or with their with their husbands, it was what was impacted, but really it was the relationships with their mothers. Last but not least, the last theme was my identity. And this was a very important theme. And it was also a very difficult one to hear because this was a relationship the women had with themselves. Most of these women felt that they weren't good enough as women. They felt that they were failing themselves, failing the Jewish people as a whole, that they couldn't produce the children to offer support to the Jewish nation, that this narrative of having to replace the Jews lost during the Holocaust was bringing them down. And they really felt that they were failed, that their bodies were failed, that they weren't fulfilling themselves, and just in general, that they were not fulfilled women if they couldn't have children. Next slide, please. Thank you. So on this slide here, I've taken some of the most striking quotes from the women's interviews. And I just wanted to illustrate some of these stories. It's difficult to talk about them all in a lot of detail, but I just wanted our listeners here tonight to begin to see what it was like to be going through an infertility journey. So just to pick out a few, you can see on here, for instance, as Maya says, our rabbi has really been so helpful. Sometimes it comes with us to our appointments and helps us to ask more questions because we ourselves don't really know what to ask. As you can see, Vicky says, it was probably the first time that I felt that this was more important than my religion. In the end, I decided I needed to balance both. And this quote is interesting because, say, for example, the women that were not so Orthodox at the beginning of their infertility journey completely changed to become ultra-Orthodox, whether it was taking on things, going to synagogue every Shabbat, or praying more, or going to the mikveh more. These women definitely took something on in order to try to, by God, to be able to have the children that they wanted. Now, I think the most striking quote, and I'd just like to end with this one, is the one of Sophie, where she says, I feel like I have got shriveled female body parts. This is how I see it. I have a very negative view of my ovaries and my cervix and the rest of it, my womb. It never really served me. And these are some of the views of the women that I interviewed, and these are some of the experiences. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm more than happy to take some questions now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Guila, and very, very interesting addition to what Susan started us off by talking about. And actually quite a similar mirror to Sue's research from the 1990s in terms of also that interviewing of women going through the process. So I'm going to start off, we've got loads and loads of questions in the chat, but I just want to start off by asking you to contextualize this a little bit, because Jewish reproduction, and we were talking about Israeli reproduction in particular, is I mean, it was so advanced. The rabbis, you both have said, are trying to find ways to say yes. And as I understand it, this is because Israel particularly is such a what we call pro-natalist society, a society about giving birth for three reasons. One is because of the commandment pruvu, be fruitful and multiply. There is a religious imperative. The next is post-Holocaust. There is this imperative to replace somehow the 6 million who died. But lastly, particularly in Israel, there is now this question of demography, this kind of political question, and this idea of, is a way to protect Israel by increasing the number of Israeli Jewish citizens being born. And I think I just wanted to start off by asking you how you feel that impacts upon the laws, the families involved, and where you think the lines are between the religious, societal, and political pressures. Maybe we'll start with Sue.
There's such a great set of questions and such important social dynamics to point out. I mean, I have to say, Guila, I thought your presentation was terrific, and you've outlined and highlighted all of the, the major and important issues. And I think it makes me, I think the pro-natalist context is key in the Jewish community. I think it's something that certainly Israelis feel extremely intensely, certainly Orthodox Jews feel extremely intensely, but it's something that doesn't really correlate necessarily with being either Israeli or Orthodox in the Jewish context. It is just a, Jews are a family-oriented society. And I'll just say one thing about all of that pressure in this context. I mean, I think Guila very nicely pointed out the kind of some of the social consequences of that pressure in terms of relationships and identity and et cetera. But there also can be real physical consequences. So many of these technologies, as much as they are miraculous for many, many people and do resolve many forms of infertility, for many people, they don't work. And the endless rounds of hormonal treatments and IVF treatments and, the hope and despair cycle creates that can go on for years and years on end. And in the Israeli context, there's no financial limitation to how long that cycle of treatment and possible failure can go on and on and on. I think one thing that's very important to bring into the conversation is that when you are trying to understand the use of these technologies within a pro-natalist society or culture, we have to remember that technologies often don't work. And there has to, this kind of drumbeat, the stampede to make sure that every Jewish womb is put to work has real consequences for people who choose to remain childless, who have very good reasons for not wanting to bring a child into the world, who have gone through rounds and rounds and rounds of treatment and have decided to adopt, which is an option that has become kind of obliterated for many people by the advent of these technologies. And there is an enormous amount of physical and mental suffering that for many people accompanies the uses of these technologies. And I just think it's really important to highlight that, and also to think, about what does it mean that you're not a person if you don't have a child, right? What does that say about a certain kind of, there have always been childless people in Jewish societies, and they found other ways to contribute and be full contributing members of the communities in which they live. If you want to take care of a dependent creature or a person, there are many, many ways to be a parent, and there are many ways to be a caring adult in your community. And unfortunately, the advent of these technologies for many people have made becoming a biological parent, sort of the singular focus of many people's adult life, and has kind of really, in very extreme cases, has kind of destroyed people's lives. You know, the 20s and 30s and sometimes 40s for people for whom these technologies just don't work. Now, that's not to say they're not miraculous, and many people have wonderful success with these technologies, and they've proved to really be incredible for many people. But there's a lot of suffering behind the scenes, and I think Guila's presentation very much highlighted some of that, and I imagine there are many other stories that can be told.
Thank you. I think that's a really full answer. So I hope you're all right, Guila. I won't bring you in now. I might bring you in with the next question. We've had lots of questions on exactly the same topic, including from Linda Stanton, but I'm going to bring up, I think, Brian Sofa to ask it, because he very clearly articulated it in the chat to me. So Brian.
Good evening. I'm speaking to you from Netanya, so it's quite late at night now. Ladies, Professor Kahn and Guila, fantastic presentation. I enjoyed everything. The one thing you didn't state clearly was, what's the Jewish attitude to surrogacy? Sue Kahn said that the rabbis had decided that babies born from a Jewish mother, that the womb was the essential thing. So I wondered what your attitude, what you found with the Jewish attitude, the rabbis' attitude to surrogacy was.
Brilliant question, thank you. Should we start with Guila and then move on to Sue? Yeah, go on, Guila.
Yes, definitely.
Oh, sorry, can you unmute?
Yeah, sure. Hi. Definitely a very brilliant question. And I think from what I researched and from the conversations I had with the rabbis, there was a consensus that first surrogacy was okay to be used. And usually the questions were on who establishes Jewish status. So for instance, if they were not using a non-Jewish surrogate, or if, say, for example, the egg came from a non-Jewish person, then who would establish Jewish status? So what I gathered from the rabbis is what is done now to remove any potential debates on Jewish status. The baby born as a result of surrogacy is dipped in the mikveh, and this baby is as such converted. So to remove any potential questions, because there isn't a clear answer of it's the egg or it's the uterus that establishes the Jewish status of the child. So this is what I gathered. Perhaps Professor Kahn can add something.
Yes, I mean that's certainly true. I think it's a very interesting question in the Israeli context. You know, Israel passed a law in 1996, which was called the Embryo Carrying Agreements Law, and it was hotly debated. Who could be a surrogate? Who were the ideal surrogates, and under what circumstances, etc. Interestingly enough, one of the questions was, could gay Israeli men contract surrogates in Israel? Initially, the law said that no, gay Jewish men could not contract surrogates. That subsequently changed. And in the intervening years, you did see this kind of fascinating social development of gay Israeli men using surrogates in Thailand and India to conceive using their own sperm generally, but using a donated egg, and then it creates so many ethical. Your question really engages the whole question of, is surrogacy ethical in and of itself, because it you're inevitably engaging the reproductive work of an economically disadvantaged woman to do that work of carrying a child. Now, that's not to say that in Israel there haven't been almost 20 years of surrogacy agreements that have been mandated, controlled, and that have produced many thousands of babies. In the Israeli context, the surrogate must be Jewish. And as what Guila says is absolutely true, that they are very concerned about the status of children born of surrogacy agreements. But in the Israeli case, one of the ways that they've dealt with that concern is to ensure that the surrogate must be Jewish. Now, those surrogates are invariably women, Jewish women in Israel of lower socioeconomic class. And, you know, to what extent a woman making that choice to rent out her body in that way is acting as sort of a free agent in a marketplace is, you know, a very challenging, engages a whole set of very challenging questions that are true for surrogacy anywhere. But there are some particular wrinkles to that question in the Israeli case, just given the social and political context of the Israeli state and who does what for whom.
So interestingly, before we go on, a member of our audience has quite a lot to say about surrogacy. So I just wonder if we could bring up David Lawrence and Anne Summers. Anne, many people might know, is quite a well-known feminist historian, among other things. And you were putting lots of comments into the chat to me about surrogacy.
Yeah, shall I? I'm in the NHS. I worked in the NHS and had to deal with surrogacy cases, and they were virtually illegal among many legal judgments in the NHS. I'm not sure, this was around 2011. I'm not sure it's still the case, but I suspect it is. Anne.
Well, it was just that the history of paying for the use of women's bodies is a really unpleasant and unhappy one. And surrogacy, you know, as a market transaction falls into that category. Babies are nicer than prostitution, but it is still paying for the use of a woman's body, and that woman is invariably a poor one. And I know of 2 cases where Israeli women have gone to India, not to poor women in Israel. And it's, you know, the renting out of brown women's bodies. Does nobody feel queasy about this? Because I do. And also in our family, without going into lots of detail, there's lots of adoption. There are Jewish children in Israel who could use adoption and good parenting. And again, that would be keeping health and happiness in the Jewish fold. And you have to also ask about people's genetic egoism.
Sorry, can I just finish by saying, I think that I meant to add that if it was paid surrogacy, I think it was illegal. I'm not sure of the legal situation of volunteer surrogacy in this country for the NHS.
Because it does happen between sisters, as we know. Yeah.
Thank you both. I don't know if Sue, you have any comment. I thought that was a really interesting phrase that Anne used about genetic egoism. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are such important points. Certainly, you know, just to broaden the conversation further, just in terms of thinking about Jewish history, you know, we have always allowed conversion. Guila mentioned, you know, the mikveh. There have always been ways of bringing people into the Jewish community besides reproducing them using your own genetic material. And because of the advent of these technologies, there has become an extraordinarily singular focus on, I thought, what was very, very nicely put as a kind of genetic egoism. And people go to unbelievably elaborate extents, use very elaborate, very expensive, really go to extraordinary lengths in order to realize their genetic, what you call their genetic egoism, in order to bring their genetic material forward. And I think that poses a real, poses a very important, I think, ethical ethical and social question about who we are as a community, as individuals, etc., and what our values are. And the whole question of brown women being, being put to work for, doing the reproductive work of, or poor women doing the reproductive work of rich women, I think is an extremely salient question. And I think in the Jewish context, the whole, the turbocharged assumption that every Jewish woman must reproduce either for herself, for someone else, whether she's married, whether she's unmarried, whether she's gay, whether she's straight, that reproduction is sort of the ultimate and only, ambition, should be the only ultimate ambition of every Jewish woman, certainly becomes very, very problematic in this context. And you see that there is pressure in Israel, enormous pressure for Jewish women to reproduce. And there is even an enormous amount of incentive for women who have carried successful pregnancies and who have proven, Jewish reproductive fitness to serve as surrogates, right? And to do that for the nation. And that's super problematic because, as I mentioned, to the extent to which women make reproductive choices to rent out or to donate their eggs, to donate their, to rent out their wombs as free agents in a market economy, really very dubious. That's the rationale behind, certainly, Israel passed this law in 1996, and the rationale was these women, nobody's compelling them to do it, they're offering to do it, they can choose not to do it, etc. But what kind of choices, how are those choices shaped by the broader set of social pressures, I think is very important to keep in mind.
Absolutely. I think I'll just tie up this conversation because we've got lots of other queries coming through. But maybe we could do a recommendation because there are a lot of people in the chat who seem interested in surrogacy. One of the students who was a research student at the same time as me, interning with Professor Kahn in Brandeis, was Ellie Tammen, who this surrogacy became the thing that she went on to really work on as her academic work. She's now a very well-known academic in her own right. So for people who want, I'll put a reference to her in the chat and you can go and read some of her work, because she did a lot of this kind of anthropological interviewing of both surrogate mothers, but also women who were becoming or had been surrogates. So interesting for people to read.
Can I interrupt you, Aviva, first?
Yeah. I was going to say she has her book published on birthing mothers. I think it's Motherhood. Yeah.
And I should just add, she tells a very rosy story, actually. I mean, the story she tells is about these extraordinary sister-like relationships that emerge between surrogates and contracting mothers. And it's really quite, in the Israeli context, and it's a quite, it's a much rosier picture than what I just depicted.
Absolutely. So we'll put it in the chat. I'm going to ask Emma, who is obtuse to write this in the chat, but it's Ellie Tammen, and I think her book's called Birthing a Mother. But as Sue says, do read it with a little bit of a critical eye. Okay, we've got another interesting line about kinship questioning. And again, a few people have asked it, but I'm going to ask Ian Lancaster, who is Chair of Jewish Renaissance, to come on screen and address it.
Yeah, thanks, Aviva, and thank you, ladies. Fascinating discussion. But it was very focused on the Orthodox position. And I'm curious as to whether there's any significant difference, what that difference may be between an Orthodox position and a progressive position here, given in particular that progressive movements in Europe, North America, certainly to my knowledge, are adopting equality of parenthood in terms of the Jewishness of the offspring, recognizing both matrilineal and patrilineal as conferring Jewishness on the offspring. How does that impact on what we're talking about here?
Thank you. Do you want to start, Guila, and then we'll throw it over to Sue?
Yes, sure. I think that's a very important question, and especially now as things evolve and how, how progressive, and especially how new questions are added as we continue to see new develops in the assisted reproductive technologies. So I think from an Orthodox perspective, things are always done in a way where, for instance, with the women I interviewed, the London Beit Din needed to agree to everything they were doing. And I have to tell you of this one story, which was unbelievable to me. This was a woman called Andrea. It's a pseudonym, so it's fine to say. She had to marry her friend in order to have a child. This was a single woman who wanted to have a child, but her family said, we will only allow you and support you financially for you to have this child if you go to the London Beit Din and do everything by the book. So she went. She was told she had to marry her friend, and this was the only way that she could then go on to have treatments and not be looked at as outside of what is known in the nuclear family. So that's the extent to which these Orthodox Jews are willing to go to have children. Now, I think when we look at things differently from a more progressive, and when we look at other Jewish denominations, there are different ways in which they look at Jewish status. And like you said, it's much more flexible. So I think perhaps now Professor Kahn can add from some of her research.
Yeah, I think that question of patrilineality particular, Sue.
Yeah.
Well, I'll give you an interesting case as well. And I mean, in broad terms, you have people making these choices within a halachic context, and then you have people making choices from a more progressive, say, or secular background, who are in the United States, in any case, are making these choices in a consumer context, right? They're really, making, that's the kind of decision making that they're bringing into these choices about quality of sperm or quality of eggs and background and, phenotypic preferences and all these kinds of things. But I'll give you an interesting question, an interesting example in terms of how this works in the Orthodox context. There was a couple that I interviewed where the father, and Guila raised this as well, where the father was a Kohen. The husband was a Kohen, and Kohen status, as you know, is conferred through the patriline. So this was a couple in which they were suffering from severe male factor infertility. The only way that they could have a child was using sperm donation. They couldn't use Jewish sperm donation for all the reasons I outlined. So they used donor sperm that came from a non-Jew. So the question was, when this father conceived a child that then would be expected to perform the public the public obligations of a Kohen, how would they deal with that, given the fact that the child wasn't in fact a Kohen? So going back to one of Gila's slides, so in that case, what this couple did in consultation with their rabbi and consultation with their doctors was they used pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to make sure that the only embryos that were implanted in the wife were female embryos, so that they wouldn't be expected to grow up and be male Kohens. So that was a way of dealing with that particular concern. I realize as I'm telling you this story, I'm not sure if that's exactly your question, but that's a halakhic context for making those kinds of choices. And in a more secular context, I would say, again, I'll just give you another interesting example. In the United States, there are ads in the back of college newspapers for Jewish egg donors. And you can make a lot of money as a young Jewish woman if you want to donate your eggs, and particularly if you've gone to an Ivy League school. And you can get up to $50,000 to $75,000 to undergo the process of having your ovaries hyperstimulated and then having your ova removed and then subsequently fertilized, etc. But that's a you are selling in a consumer context your biogenetic material.
May I just come back on one point for clarification for me? because it seems to me that you are creating the dichotomy between Orthodox halacha and consumerism or secularism. There is, of course, progressive halacha, and that's really what I was trying to ask about. I'd be frank, I don't know exactly where it is, although I've been part of the discussion about patrilinearity. We have to recognize there is progressive halacha. It's not a scale between Orthodox halacha and secular.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And I think on that note, we do have a progressive rabbi with us, Rabbi Savil Sheridan. I don't know, we do have a couple more questions from the audience, but maybe I'll bring Sybil in now anyway, and just kind of ask her to comment on that.
Wow. Well, I mean, it's really quite difficult to define what progressive halacha is. There's a big distinction between, say, the Masorti position, which will actually take traditional halacha and then look at alternatives to come to a conclusion, and perhaps the Reform and Liberal community, which are actually, I think, probably more concerned about the social and relational dimensions than they are specifically with, who is a Jew. And I think that probably is the big difference between the two. That, from the Orthodox, it really is important, that the egg is that the host is Jewish, or, ensuring it through mikveh, or in the case of a Kohen, I mean, that's a really difficult one, I think. Whereas progressively, I think we're much more concerned with what is the best thing in terms of the relationship of the people involved.
So what that raises for me, thank you, is the really interesting question that we're going to come on to, because I know when you're asking what is the best relationship, what is the best solution for the people involved, previously a lot of those questions were about for the parents. Now I think a lot of those questions are also about the children. And I might sum it up, so we don't have much time, but it's a question that's coming up over and over again in the text chat, is this question around anonymity. A lot of the original kind of decision making around sperm donation was done on the condition that the sperm donor was anonymous. There are now a lot of instances of children of anonymous donation finding out who their fathers were through things like Ancestry.com or 23andMe. There is someone who is going to be watching the recording of this talk who emailed me because she and her partner had a child by anonymous sperm donation, went to a support group for other women who had had children from anonymous sperm donation, and some of the women looked at their children and thought, gosh, our children look very like each other. And now this lesbian couple who had an only child of a son find that their son now has very, very many step siblings or half siblings that they have discovered by having these children genetic tested. So I don't know where you want to go, but is there a question now, and what do you think the solution should be around anonymous donation? Maybe we'll start with Sue.
Well, I think it's a great question, Aviva, because as you very rightly point out, there's really no such thing as anonymity anymore. Anonymity was this, was operationalized in the early days of these technologies, but for all sorts of reasons, there really is no such thing as anonymity anymore. I mean, that said, there are a lot of secrets. Right? People keep a lot of secrets with these technologies, and many people never admit to having used any kind of donor material in the conception of their children. Certainly, many people even hide and keep secrets about the fact that their child was conceived with a surrogate as well. And I think there are a whole range of, there's a whole range of stigmas associated with infertility, associated with, the concept or the idea of having to need help, to need external help. You know, those are just a sort of a smattering of responses to the question of anonymity, but, you know, there may be no more anonymity, but there certainly will continue to be secrets around fertility and infertility.
Guila, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I think just something small. In the past, I used to work at the London Women's Clinic, and in fact, I was the recruiter for egg donors. And one of the selling points was the anonymity. So as I mentioned, the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority regulate and used to regulate this. So the law changed, I think, in the early 2000s, where it was anyone donating eggs or sperm would be anonymous until the age of 18 of the offspring. So when the offspring became 18, they can find out who donated, and they could go to the HFEA and ask the questions. And like this, there was the potential. But now with the way how genomic medicine has advanced and how accessible it is, anyone can book this 23andMe test and find out who they're related to, if they're carriers for any specific genetic conditions. And I think here's the moral and ethical question: should all this information this information being available to people? Should it be so easy to find things out? And I think, just to feed back on what Professor Kahn said, a lot of people never tell their families they're going through infertility. And this was what I found in my research. So will their offspring find out as a shock that they might be carriers for the BRCA gene, and then also find out that they didn't get it from their family, they got it from someone else? So I guess this is perhaps research for the future.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I'm going to give Sue the final word, because 20 years ago, you did a lot of this research with women who are having these treatments. Now their children have come of age. Is there anything following up what this children's experiences are, or can you talk about that at all? You know, what kind of research is out there?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Aviva, again, for inviting me. And it's wonderful to see you. And I will say on this note, there is an army of social scientists in Israel who are doing work in this area. I think, as Guila's work clearly demonstrates, you know, the questions don't go away; they just become more complicated. And the challenges of negotiating infertility in a Jewish context, and then in a broader national context, right, where there's different availability of these technologies, and there's different options, and there's different attitudes, and all kinds of different sorts of forces are swirling around. Ensures that there's going to be a range of new studies, important new studies that continue to be conducted. So I guess I would say that I know that in the Israeli context, there's lots of very exciting work that continues to come out, and I wish I could put something in the chat, but you know, Guila raised one of the most interesting questions, which is about the three-mother question. That's emerging with the use of mitochondrial DNA. And you know, it's interesting halachically, right? Because it's sort of sharpening that question of what is a mother, and where does motherhood, where does Jewishness come from? And it's challenging the rabbis in many ways, the Orthodox rabbis, and I think certainly it's challenging progressive Jews as well. To sort of operationalize and make literal what's important to them, what constitutes a family, what kinship is, and I will just perhaps conclude by saying, you know, that we can't forget, like, you know, the point is to nurture and care for other people. That's the point, right? I see a few nodding heads. I think we're probably all on the same page about that. But it's not just about, you know, what extraordinary recipes we can concoct in a laboratory for creating human beings. It's how in the world do we continue to care for each other and maintain some kind of continuity for, you know, a set of traditions that we all obviously hold so dear.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm going to bring Sybil in to do a proper thank you to everyone and also tell us about how we're continuing from this next week.
Right. Well, I would like to say that in the many, many years that I have been giving votes of thanks to people, never before has the speaker actually taken the words out of my mouth. But Susan, what you just said was exactly where I was going to go, because I wanted to thank you both so much for this fascinating, essentially history going back 40 plus years, the age of Aviva, in the incredible developments that there have been in this area. But both of you also in such enormous agreement, although you are talking about different periods and how, of where it goes, so incredibly in agreement, not only on the sort of scientific developments, but on the importance of those human relationships. And I think that this is a thing, as you have just said, this so, Susan, is, you know, that is so important. And I think this is what really engages our attentions. It's fascinating to look at the science. But ultimately, as human beings, it is the human cost that really interests us. You've raised more questions than you have answered, and you've answered many of them. I can only say that I look forward to hearing more from you both on another occasion, I hope. I do hope we will have the opportunities in future years to bring you back to hear more on the subject. Thank you both so very much. Just very quickly, that next week when we are looking at, yes, organ donation, we've got Professor Anthony Warrens and Graham and Dr. Graham Litkin, who are both experts in this field. We're looking at 3 types of organ donation, you know, human, animal, and artificial, and look forward to seeing you all then. So thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you. And if people want to unmute themselves and just offer some appreciation, you're very able to before we sign off.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Interesting.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
And by the way, just to say Mazel Tov, I believe Jnetics has just hit its match funding target. So I don't know if everyone in the audience is aware, we've been doing match funding for Jnetics the last 2 days, and we have just hit the target for 650,000 to ensure genetic screening in the UK for Jewish diseases can continue over the next few years. So big Mazel Tov, Guila.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, and good evening.
Bye.
Thank you.